returning to Chicago after 2 weeks touring Milwaukee and Madison seemed, until that morning, the perfect cap to a trip I'd dreamed of for years. The train from Union Station left me in a strange state of calm. I had in my suitcase small, carefully wrapped boxes, a silk scarf for Paige, an antique photography book for Garrett, and bakery treats to accompany our first coffee together. I'd saved each purchase thinking of their faces, imagining a warm moment in the home kitchen. The taxi took the curve of my street, the one I'd walked so many times with shopping bags, and then I saw something that made me frown. Along the sidewalk, right in front of my door, black garbage bags were lined up, tied with tight knots, like silent mounds guarding the entrance. Among them, nailed to the iron gate, a small white sign, "For sale." I felt a dry cold in my stomach. I hadn't mentioned anything about selling, and I was still the owner. Before I could organize my thoughts, the taxi stopped. Garrett was standing by the gate, arms crossed, jaw tense. Paige, a couple of steps behind, held a folder against her chest and lowered her gaze from time to time. But on her lips was something like a contained smile. I paid the driver, got out with my suitcases, and, before opening my mouth, he spoke, "You don't live here anymore, Mom." It wasn't a greeting or an explanation. It was a sentence. I stood looking at him, trying to decipher if that was a bad joke, but his voice left no room for doubt. "It's for your own good," he added. "This house is too big for you alone. We need the space for our family." His words floated in the air, harsh and alien. I looked at the bags again, trying to recognize what part of my life they had packed without me. Paige avoided my gaze, but her eyes shone with a gleam I couldn't ignore. I took a slow breath, feeling how the heat of the street mixed with an icy current running through me. I didn't understand yet what was happening, but something in that sign and those bags told me the explanation wouldn't be simple, and that I had to prepare to hear it. Garrett didn't take long to disguise his decision with a paternalistic tone. "Mom, you're 68 years old. This house is too big for you alone. You'd live better in a smaller apartment, without so many stairs. More comfortable," he said, as if he were doing me a favor. His words awakened in me a succession of images that tightened my chest. Since I became a widow 15 years ago, I'd maintained that house with my pension and the savings we'd set aside for old age. In that time, I'd helped Garrett more times than he'd remember loans to cover his debts. Bills paid in silence. Even guarantees that cost me sleepless nights. I remembered vividly one afternoon, months earlier. Paige was in the kitchen, serving coffee with a studied sweetness. Between sips, she tossed out her comment like someone dropping an obvious truth, "A house this big. It's kind of wasted on just one person, don't you think?" "Garrett." He smiled sideways, as if the idea seemed reasonable. I was there, pretending not to listen, but inside, something stirred. It was the first time I felt an uncomfortable echo, though I silenced it with the hope that it was just an innocent observation. Now, facing the bags and the "for sale" sign, that phrase took on a different weight. Garrett insisted that everything was for my well-being, that I'd have less work and fewer expenses, but his voice lacked the warmth that accompanies genuine concerns. I fixed my gaze on his eyes, searching for any crack that might betray the truth. I found nothing but a calculated coldness. Paige, behind him, maintained that half-smile, as if everything were following a pre-agreed script. The urgency of his proposal stung me. There was no dialogue, no alternatives, just a plan executed without my consent. And though I didn't yet know the real motive, a certainty grew inside me that haste had nothing to do with my comfort, I stayed silent, feeling how a distrust began to burn that wouldn't take long to push me to seek answers. That same afternoon, I gathered what little I could and moved into Sylvia's place, my lifelong friend. Her apartment on Oak Street wasn't large, but it had a warmth that didn't depend on square footage. But on the way, she opened the door and served you coffee without asking questions. The first few days I spent between confusion and rage, trying to understand how my life could have flipped in an instant. From the window of Sylvia's living room, on the 4th floor with a view of my old street, I could see the roof of my house. It wasn't much, but it kept me connected to what had been my home. One morning, while we were having tea, I saw it a suited man, briefcase in hand, entering and exiting through the gate of my house. He carried folders and what looked like folded blueprints under his arm. He didn't stay more than 20 minutes, but he returned twice that same week. I didn't have to wonder too much to intuit that it wasn't a casual visit. The confirmation came a few days later. I was returning from running an errand in the neighborhood and decided, almost without thinking, to pass by my old sidewalk. It was night, and the entry light was on. Paige was on the porch, talking on the phone. With that animated tone I'd rarely heard from her, I stopped a few meters away, hidden in the shadow. By the end of the month, we'll be settled in the big house, she said, and let out a brief giggle, like someone savoring a victory. I continued on my way without her seeing me. But those words accompanied me like a cutting echo. She wasn't talking about my comfort, but about their move, and to a big house that, from what I intuited, wasn't mine. That night, I could barely sleep. The image of the suited man and Paige's voice intertwined in my head, forming a pattern too clear to be coincidence. Something was moving behind my door, and I was going to find out what it was, no matter the cost. One afternoon, while returning from the market with Sylvia, we ran into Mr. Ellis, my lifelong neighbor. He'd always been discreet, but that day he stopped me with a hand on my arm and a look that mixed concern and caution. "Vivian, I have to tell you something," he murmured, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. "I've seen Garrett meeting several times with people from a real estate agency. It didn't seem like just any visit. They carried folders, blueprints, and stayed chatting on the sidewalk." I felt an uncomfortable heat rising up my neck. I tried to stay calm, but the question came out on its own. "Do you know what they were talking about?" Mr. Ellis hesitated for a second. "I don't know for sure, but in the neighborhood, it's being said that there's a foreign investor interested. Someone who pays in cash and wants to close quickly." His words hit me hard. It wasn't a vague suspicion or my paranoia. My son was moving everything to sell my house, and he was doing it with a haste that fit too well with the phrase I'd overheard from Paige by the end of the month. "We'll be settled." I thanked Mr. Ellis, and we continued on our way. Though I no longer heard what Sylvia was saying to me, each step felt heavier. The rage burned in my chest, mixed with a stab of betrayal that kept repeating to me that the roof which had sheltered my family for decades was about to be handed over to a stranger. That night I sat with Sylvia in the kitchen and we talked for hours, between sips of coffee. I started to consider something I'd pushed from my mind until then: legal options. I knew the house was still in my name, but I didn't fully understand what limits Garrett had to act on his own. Sylvia promised to introduce me to an acquaintance of hers, a retired lawyer who'd helped several neighbors with housing issues. For the first time in days, I felt that maybe I wasn't completely defenseless and that there was a path to stop that sale before it became irreversible. I couldn't keep sleeping on Sylvia's couch. No matter how much she insisted, it didn't bother her. With her help, I found a modest apartment downtown, a couple of blocks from the farmer's market in Lincoln Park. It didn't have the spaciousness or light of my house, but it did have a tranquility I was starting to value. 4 walls that, though rented, were mine as long as I paid, and no one could evict me without notice. Moving in there was strange. The boxes I brought were few and most contained only the essentials. But each time I placed an object on a shelf, I felt a mix of grief and hope. Grief for everything I'd lost and hope for what I could still build. To avoid getting trapped in my thoughts, I signed up for a painting workshop at the neighborhood cultural center. At first, my hands trembled over the brush. But soon, I discovered that losing myself in the colors calmed me. The group was small and welcoming. There no one knew me as Garrett's mother, but simply as Vivian, the woman who painted clumsy but lively lilies. It was on one of those afternoons that Sylvia introduced me to Conrad, a tall man with white hair and a serene gaze. He'd retired from law practice, but still collaborated with neighbors on legal matters, especially related to housing. I told him my situation without beating around the bush, and he listened patiently, asking specific questions. First things first. "Vivienne," he said at the end, "you should thoroughly review the documents for your house. Deeds, property records, any notarized powers. Sometimes people assume they've lost more control than they've actually given up." His words echoed in my head long after we said goodbye. That night, in my small living room, I wondered if perhaps I still had more legal strength than Garrett and Paige believed, and if I could use it to change the course of everything they were planning. Conrad came to my apartment with a folder and an air that mixed curiosity and determination. On the dining table, we spread out the original deeds to the house, the property registry, and a few papers I hadn't reviewed in years. While he read, I watched the movement of his eyebrows, searching for any sign before he spoke. "Here it is, Vivienne," he said after a few minutes. "You're still the sole owner. There's no signed transfer or notarized power that allows your son to act in your name. Legally, he can't sell the property without your express authorization." I felt such intense relief that I had to close my eyes. Not only had they not taken my house from me yet, but the plan they seemed to have was built on much shakier ground than they imagined. And if they try anyway, I asked, they could try. But the buyer would run into a serious problem when registering the property. Most likely, the deal would fall through as soon as a lawyer reviews the documents. I stayed silent, absorbing the information. My first reaction was to think about confronting Garrett, putting the papers on the table and forcing him to admit everything. But soon, something inside me called for prudence. If he believed he had a clear path, maybe it would be better to let him advance a little further and see how far he was willing to go. Conrad advised me to keep the originals in a safe place and stay alert to any movement. I promised. And when he left, I stayed alone, looking at that folder as if it were a shield. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept deeply. I knew I couldn't get complacent, but also that I held in my hands a key they didn't expect absolute control over the future of that house. I decided to wait, observe, and when the moment came, use that advantage to my benefit. I didn't imagine that moment would arrive sooner than I thought, accompanied by a collapse that would change the rules of the game for all of us. 6 months passed since that conversation with Conrad. During that time, I limited myself to living my life, painting in the workshop, strolling through the market, and avoiding any direct contact with Garrett and Paige. I knew that, sooner or later, something would break in their plan, and I didn't intend to be the one to give them the news. One September morning, the insistent sound of the phone woke me before dawn. At first, I thought it would be a medical emergency from some acquaintance, but when I turned on the screen, I found a figure that left me chilled 60 messages from Garrett, all received in the last 24 hours. I opened the first. Mom, we need to talk urgently. The next was more desperate. The buyer backed out because of issues with the deed. I didn't need to read much more to understand that my silence had borne fruit. As I progressed through the reading, the story completed itself. The sale had fallen through because the investor's lawyer detected that the property was still solely in my name and there was no authorization to transfer it. The preliminary contract was annulled, and with it, the illusions of quick money they'd nurtured for months. But that wasn't all. Between message and message, I discovered that the business Garrett had started with help from his mother-in-law and investment in commercial spaces had failed. The construction halted. The partners withdrew, and he was left in debt up to his neck. The final blow was in the last lines. Paige has gone to her mother's in Denver. She says she doesn't want to live amid problems. I stayed sitting in bed, phone in hand, processing each piece of that collapse. Part of me felt a pang of compassion, but another part, firmer and quieter, remembered each of the black bags in front of my house and the for sale sign. I didn't respond immediately. I closed the phone and left it on the table, knowing that, sooner or later, I'd have to decide whether to meet with a son who only seemed to seek me out when he had nothing left. 2 days after receiving his messages, I responded with a single phrase, "If you want to talk." Tomorrow at 5 at the Liberty Cafe. I chose that place on purpose. It was a historic cafe downtown, with wide windows and the aroma of cinnamon, where I used to take him as a child after visiting the Art Institute. A place loaded with memories that, perhaps, would force him to look at me differently. I arrived before him and ordered a latte. I saw him enter with quick steps. His shirt wrinkled, and a shadow of dark circles I didn't remember seeing on him. He sat across from me without greeting, as if the words weighed too heavily. "Mom, what happened with the house wasn't how you think he started." Avoiding my gaze, Paige insisted a lot. She said it was the best, that with the money we could invest and secure the future. I took a sip of coffee, letting him speak. Besides, things haven't gone well. The business didn't work out. I'm left with nothing. And, well, you know about Paige. I nodded slowly, without interrupting. I'd expected justifications, and there they were. Perfectly aligned pressure from someone else. Bad luck. Anything but his own responsibility. "Garrett," I said at last, with a firm voice, "I'm not going back to live with you. I'm not lending you money either. It's not out of resentment. It's because I need to protect myself." He frowned, as if he hadn't expected such clarity. "But you can do something." "Yes. I can help you find an affordable rental and, if necessary, give you a small support for a few months. But that's all." His lips tightened, and he looked away toward the window. It wasn't the answer he wanted, but he wasn't in a position to reject it either. I, meanwhile, limited myself to drinking the last sip of my coffee, aware that this conversation would set the tone for everything that came after. I explained my terms calmly, like reciting something already thought through. I'd help him find an affordable rental in a neighborhood where he could start over without impossible expenses, and I'd contribute a fixed amount for 6 months. There would be no cash beyond that, no extra favors, no intervention in my accounts. And the most important thing I added, you have to respect my boundaries. There won't be discussions about the house or attempts to pressure me to change my mind. Garrett looked at me with a mix of surprise and resentment. He wasn't used to hearing me speak like this, with a certainty that left him no room to negotiate. For a few seconds, I thought he'd get up and leave, but what he did was sigh and nod. "Okay," he murmured. "I accept." It didn't sound grateful, but resigned. And yet, that acceptance, though forced by necessity, was a silent victory for me. For years I'd given in, let my motherly affection cover uncomfortable conversations. Now, for the first time, the relationship was established under my conditions. We finished the coffee without much more to say. He left first, with slow steps. As if each meter to the door weighed on him, I stayed a few minutes longer, watching people come and go, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. Sadness because there was no real reconciliation, because the wounds were still open. Relief because, at least, I'd regained control over my life and over what I was willing to give. When I left the cafe, the afternoon air greeted me with an unexpected warmth. I knew it wouldn't be easy to stay firm if he tried to cross those boundaries again, but I had the certainty that, this time, my voice wouldn't tremble, and with that security in mind, I walked toward my apartment, without imagining that very soon the moment would come to test that determination. A year after all that, I was able to take a step that in the worst days seemed impossible. With the savings I'd set aside and the sale of a small property I had in the countryside, I bought a bright apartment in the Lakeview neighborhood. It wasn't large, but it had a sunny balcony where I placed pots overflowing with red and white geraniums, the ones I'd always dreamed of growing without having to ask anyone's permission. The first morning I woke up there, the silence felt different. It wasn't empty, but peace. I opened the windows, and the warm spring air came in with the scent of blooming trees. In that instant, I knew that place was more than a roof. It was a symbol that I could start over on my own terms. I wanted to celebrate it. So I organized an afternoon snack with my friends from the painting workshop. We filled the table with homemade treats and porcelain cups. Amid laughter and anecdotes, I raised my glass of sweet wine and said, "Here's to homes where no one can evict you without your permission." They applauded and toasted with me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt that toast was also for my own freedom. Weeks later, when I'd already decorated every corner with paintings and plants, a letter from the bank arrived. Upon opening it, I found a cold and concise report. Garrett had tried to use my name as a guarantor for a loan. The operation had been rejected for lack of authorization. I stayed for a moment with the paper in hand, letting the mix of indignation and relief settle. In the end, I folded it calmly and put it away in a drawer. I smiled, not with resentment, but with the certainty that I'd not only saved my house, but also my future. I looked at the geraniums on the balcony, lit up under the sun, and thought that, sometimes, losing a roof is the only way to build your own. And for this one, I'd be willing to fight always.